Okay guys, today we're going to talk about occurrence versus claims made policies. So basically in construction, almost 100% of the policies that we see for our clients will be on an occurrence form. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the differences on claims made for contractors because you're never going to see them and we're never going to sell them. But what you will see is claims made policies on professional liability policies, EPLI policies, directors and officers policies. But at another time we'll go through those because it's fairly complicated and the triggers are complicated, and again, depending upon the type of policy, a D&O or an EPLI, they're somehow different, they're sometimes different. So today we're going to really talk about just the two major differences between the two policy forms. Next. Okay, occurrence, there's two methods really to decide between the coverages on what's triggered on an occurrence form versus a claims made form. If you go to the next one. Okay, occurrence forms. Almost all the policies you'll see, even on property policies where there's liability, etc., will be on an occurrence form. An occurrence form, this is the most important thing, it's triggered by the event of the claim. BI or PD is what triggers the policy during the policy period, obviously in the policy territory as well. And it provides coverage for claims that happen much later on, but that occur, where that initial property damages happens during the policy period. So you could have a claim that would happen during a policy period that you didn't know about, and then 5 years later there's a suit. As long as it happened during the policy period, that's going to be covered. It's again triggered by an accident, and under the forms you'll see under an occurrence that definition is that accident that happens that triggers the property damage or bodily injury. And again, it doesn't matter how long. The statute of repose in California is 10 years. So most of the construction defect cases that we see happen 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10 years later, and it'll come back and we'll determine that the cause of the damage happened during a policy many years prior, and hence that company will be obligated to pay both indemnity and defense on that particular claim. Next form. So the claims made form is different, is that it's not triggered by when the accident happens, but actually when it's reported. So that's much different. In a claims made policy, as soon as you become aware of the claim, you must report that claim to the carrier. Again, this gets a little detailed as to what is actually reported, because sometimes you get notice and you don't think it's going to be a claim. It doesn't have to be a lawsuit. And there's different claim forms on a claims made policy, one that's called claims made reported, and there's certain obligations under that. Again, we're not going to go through that today, but when we talk about D&O and professional liability policies, we'll talk about those respective triggers. A claims made policy can go backwards, which is called a retroactive date. Typically, when you write a claims made policy, they'll take a retroactive date to the first beginning date. So again, a claims made policy, because it's when the claim's reported, the claim actually doesn't have to happen during that policy period. So if we write a third year of a claims made policy and we take the retroactive date to the very first day we wrote that policy, that insurance company will pay for a claim that happened several years prior, as long as it's reported during their policy period. So that's the retroactive date. They also have a reporting date that you can take, or a tail that you can buy, so that if you end the policy, then you can report the claim later and have it covered. Okay, it's called an extended reporting period. Typically at the end of a policy it's 30 or 60 days, but in the case, for example, when we sold ARM, Lynn and I bought tail coverage for Goodman and for ARM that took us out for 10 years for late reporting claims for an occurrence that happened during our policy term but was reported late. So we talked about that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in an occurrence policy form, I tried to do this as simple as we could. So you have a policy in year 1, policy in year 2, and again, a claim happens much later on, we're going to make the determination when did the bodily injury or property damage happen, and that's the claim that's going to pay. So if it happened here, this is the policy going to pay. Even if we're talking 10 years later, we're always going to come back and this policy is going to pay. They have an obligation to pay when damage actually happens, okay? And you don't need extended reporting periods on occurrence policies, because just the form itself, the insuring agreement, will allow you to go back and have that covered triggered by that particular carrier. The claims made form says it has to be reported, and hence you need an extended reporting period. Next slide. So at a claims made form, again, it has to be reported during the policy period to pay, but you have 2 extra things in that policy. You have a retroactive date that you can go back several policy years, and you have extended reporting periods that will extend either on a typical policy 30 days, or you can buy a 1-year, 3-year, or up to actually 10 years extension to report that claim. So that's different than the occurrence form. Again, if you stop an occurrence policy, okay, that doesn't mean coverage is going to stop. So if you have a contractor that buys a policy for 2 years and he goes out of business, right? And a claim happens 3 or 4 years later, as long as we can show that the bodily injury or property damage happened when he had the policy, there'll be coverage. But let's take an example where he did the work during year 1 or 2. 5 years later, okay, a sudden and accidental loss happens, and the damage happens 5 years later. Then the guy's got no coverage, because it didn't happen during the policy period. There was no damage or no property damage during the policy period. So it's really important for us to advise clients, if they're going out of business, what we can do to protect them. And that's typically what we suggest is buy a completed ops policy, discontinued operations policy to protect that particular client. They're very expensive. Most clients don't do it, so we suggest that they try to wind up their operations and close business. Next slide. Again, this is kind of going over the reporting periods for claims made. Typically, you've got 30 days. Again, the claim has to occur during the policy period, but can be reported later. Again, you have extensions of reporting periods, and the language is different on some of the retro dates. So you got claims made policies are all very different, unlike most occurrence policies that we see. So when you get something like that, we'll have to take a look at it. Especially you'll see them differ between EPLI policies and D&O policies. Next slide. Again, this is just the kind of the front page of the insuring agreement. We're going to pay for BI or PD that results during the policy period and in its territory, and then losses that, again, the new form that says if a client or an officer or director knew about it, then we have a problem. If they've had knowledge prior to the policy, before the policy, that won't be covered. So that's kind of the differences between claims and occurrence policies.
Can you answer or speak to one issue real quick? What's the big concern if we have a sole proprietor and he has a GL policy that he doesn't want to carry forward? Explain the risk of that versus being a corporation and shutting down the corporation.
Okay, so if a sole proprietor, John's Electric, decides to do business for 3 or 4 years, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to retire, I'm going to close my doors. So he decides to shut his business down. Okay, remember that the California statute says that he's responsible for all bodily injury or property damage that happens for the statute of repose, which is 10 years in California. So a claim happens 4 or 5 years later. They sue the sole proprietor. Okay, he's fully liable. And because it's not a corporation, he can't it's nothing to shut down. Even though he closed his business, he's still personally liable. The difference with a corporation is that if the company shut down the company properly, went through all the channels paid their taxes, shut it down officially in the state of California, the likelihood of breaking that corporate veil is pretty slim. And our experience and what we've seen, especially Justin and I over a lot of the years, is that they don't ever try to pierce the corporate veil. Once they find out the corporation has been closed and it's officially dead, they just drop the case. But that sole proprietor, he could be on that claim forever. So we really don't like to see contractors act as a sole proprietor. We always suggest that they incorporate, okay, or form a limited liability company, because a partnership has the same carry forward in liability as a sole proprietorship.